the lines around what I do are really fuzzy. The thing that ties them together in many ways is my sense that that both historical events related to the Jewish faith and now to the Christian church, these sacred texts speak to us from a very, very long distance away, but in ways that are very relevant to us if we learn how to hear them correctly. And that's a process that we can't always do on our own, but it is a process that we can engage in. And then that there are steps, both intellectually responsible steps, but also steps that are motivated by our faith commitment, my faith commitment as a Christian, to work out how those translate into our views on politics, ethics, economics, parenting, you name it, whatever, that there are knock-on effects for this. And so I'm always just trying to work out the answers to those questions. They lead in very, very, very different ways. I've sometimes described research that I've done in my research program as research without a map. Which I always gloss by saying that's a sophisticated academic way of saying I'm making it up as I go. And hoping that providentially that leads into productive spaces.
As you know, Casey, tonight's called More Questions Than Answers. And you've started to allude towards some areas of interest.
There you go.
I guess the question that I'd like to ask, really to kick things off, is what questions are you wrestling with at the moment? What are you bringing to Scripture, and kind of what's really kind of getting you to think through how you are working as a scholar at the moment?
This is the longest period of time I've been at home. I've slept in my own bed continuously for ages and ages and ages and ages, maybe in my entire life. And the fact that for me that has dialed down the busyness a lot has allowed a lot of questions and things to bubble up. Some of those are things that I was thinking about beforehand. I said I work on migration. I've been engaged with the way in which my research engages with migration for a long time. When I started that work now 7 or 8 years ago, I thought it would have its sort of 15 minutes of fame. A couple of years, it would be interesting if everybody would move on and I'd be done as well. But migration has remained a huge issue. And so when we came into, this period over the last year, I was already thinking about those sorts of things, thinking that the context for that would be, we finally completed an agreement to leave the European Union. There was now going to be a discussion about migration policy here in the UK that was UK based only. And there were going to be, things to deal with there. And, that was kind of put on pause, yeah. But then again, it hasn't gone away because, if you followed the news at all in the last couple of days, one of the big headlines has been about what the government's doing with the Napier barracks and the housing of asylum, people seeking asylum. And so it's manifested in different ways, but that issue remains unbelievably relevant about what it means as a community of hosts. Yes. What's our view beyond borders, beyond this island, to those sorts of people, and to people that are marginalized and in need. Yeah. But what's been really, I think, amplified over the last year for me is the whole question of how I reckon with my position. I mean, this is Zoom, and it doesn't take, more than about 3 seconds for you to work out looking at me that I'm a middle-aged, middle-class, white male. I'm superbly privileged in having been from the United States of America, having had a great education, having moved over here and had a great education and all that sort of stuff. And to look around at whatever you want to pick as the presenting point, right? Is it the George Floyd murder, the trial that's going on right now with Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, the death of Daunte Wright in the last few weeks, the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, that's been a big thing. The manifestation of all of that here in the UK. Some important things that have come out, like Azariah France Williams' book on the Church of England, Ghost Ship, all that sort of stuff has really forced me back to not just be thinking about those questions, but thinking about the way in which I'm handling them specifically from a context of race.
How does that change how you read the texts? How does it change how you look into the Hebrew scripture? What's going on that's different because you're recognizing some of those things?
So let me walk you through a kind of autobiographical stroke, research story. So I've been working on the book of Genesis for some years now. And I've been working on how we read and reread those texts through the lens of migration. And basically the insight arises from having read those texts and realized that, basically every character from Abraham to the end of Genesis is not only a migrant at some point, but is an involuntary migrant. So, Abraham moves, but then there's a famine and he and Sarah have to go to Egypt. There's the whole story about them, passing Sarah off as his sister, not his wife. And there's all sorts of complex issues around that. They force Hagar to be a migrant after she joins the family. They kick her and Ishmael out again later. Isaac faces a famine and has to flee with Rebekah. Jacob, can be, I think, very understandably viewed as an involuntary migrant. He has to go. He's afraid Esau is going to kill him. He's at fault to some degree for that, but he then has to flee for his own life. Laban treats him very harshly. So you can do this all the way. Joseph ends up in Egypt. There's a famine. His whole family ends up with him. He's been trafficked. Then there's a famine that reunites him with his family. The whole plot of Genesis is about this. But the more I realized that it was about involuntary migration, and that my experience of migration as a white, middle-aged, middle-class, privileged man was very different from that experience of migration. I thought, I want to read the text through that experience, but I can't actually do that on my own because of that. And so I wanted to get at how do you do that?
Yeah.
But I couldn't do it on my own. Yeah. So very long story short, I conceived of a project where I worked with a woman here in Sheffield called Emily Taylor, who's an artist and an art therapist. And we drew on methods from art therapy so that we could work with 6 people who were either seeking sanctuary or living as refugees here in Sheffield, to read those stories together because of their traumatic experiences, because they were living in the very precarious situation of, several of them having been through the detention system, all of them waiting, except for one, for decisions that no one had any idea when they were going to come from the Home Office about whether they could stay, whether they might be deported the next day or the next week or any of that. It was a very complex situation. But they helped me read those stories in a way that I didn't previously have the capacity to do because my experience of migration was different. And it opened up all sorts of things, like the way in which Laban takes advantage of Jacob when he says, okay, you can marry Rachel, but then he switches Leah in on Rachel. That this is very much the way the Home Office treats people, right? These are the rules until we change them because we're a monopoly. Who's going to tell us we can't, right? We have the almighty imprimatur. You have to have our permission to stay here. You do what we want, the way we want it, when we say we want you to do it. What are your other options? So I had that experience. It was transformational for me to think about how do we try and engage with people who have that lived experience, which I can appreciate to some degree, but not what I need to truly understand things.
How did the people that you were working with, how did they feel about being in that kind of context of wrestling with those stories?
Yeah, for most of them, at one level, they in many ways, the most, I think, transformational part of that project for them was the fact that we managed, not always elegantly, but we managed to communicate to them that they were there as intellectual equals, that they were, that we perceived them as people with knowledge, lived experience, and potential insight. And that there was, a lot of kind of scaffolding we had to put up to make the space where we were together a safe space and to allow them to engage in that way and to hopefully not re-traumatize them and all that. But at the very core, after we shared a meal together and when we looked at a text and we just talked about a text, I was there because I valued what they had to say. I saw them as as intellectual collaborators, not as people to be cared for, not as, not any less than people to be cared for, not any less than people who were in a marginalized situation that I could try to help, but also as intellectual equals and collaborators from whom I could learn something.
So you weren't there just to abstract their knowledge or take their insight. Actually, they were part of co-creating that space.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so when I talk about the way in which I read Genesis, I talk about the fact that it's partially their insight, it's partially my insight. I mean, I do bring things from my training, from my own experience, from my involvement, and it's partially our reading together. Which one is, I don't know. It's like, you make a cup of tea, you put the milk in at the end, which bit is the milk and which bit is the tea? At the end of the process, you can't really say, even though, these different things have contributed in different ways. And so, for me, that's a model both of the fact that we often set up people like me with degrees and training and experience as the expert who can tell us things. And I'm a big believer that expertise counts for something, and that there are times when you need experts. But actually what I would say was my recognition that the book of Genesis, and actually quite a lot of other texts in the Bible, are about not just migration, but the experience of involuntary migration. What it helps us understand is the sort of expertise we need is in part a lived experience of people who actually have gone through that experience, are going through that experience, and can help us understand it better. So yes, I bring expertise in ancient languages and all these other things, but that's not the full extent of expertise and insight that we need to try and understand these things. And that it is often people who've experienced that, or I know in other work you've done with the Poverty Truth Commissions, things, people who've experienced poverty, that is that contributes so much to our understanding. It's not ignoring expertise, it's recognizing that expertise often has a definition that goes beyond what we would typically give to it.
Casey, what we beginning to hear of how the process of that piece of research went. I guess, where did it lead to? What was your insights? And particularly, how does that relate to the questions that you're still wrestling with and that actually all collectively we're wrestling with today?
Sometimes as a scholar of the text, what I ultimately want to do is make it something that people can engage with and learn from. But the first step in that is often to make it as unfamiliar to us as possible, so that we can then engage in that process as productively as we can. So part of what this made me realize was how much, the Hebrew Bible is a text about, involuntary migration, written by involuntary migrants to other, involuntary migrants. And that's not most of our experience. And so we have to defamiliarize it from ourselves in that way. Then we can begin to approach it again, and we can begin to see new things about it as we do that. The danger then, so what does that mean? What it means is being self-reflective about our own context and our own biases and the things that we bring to the text, the things that we don't bring to the text, what have you. And what I would say, part of what's happened over the last 6 to 9 months that's driven that home for me, which is the kind of other half of this story that I was going to tell, is, after having worked on this and talked about this and written about this, and, and people ask me, okay, well, you seem to have worked this out now. And I would think, that feels a bit dangerous. I haven't. I got asked by a friend to write an essay on the ethics of the Jacob narrative. And what does it mean to try and deal with, the fact that Jacob is lying and he's using these tricks to get things from Laban and to free himself. And what are the ethics of this? I thought, okay, well, I'll write on the ethics of the Jacob narrative. And as I was doing that, I was rereading some different stuff because, of everything that was happening in COVID, everything that's happening with Black Lives Matter, everything that was happening with race relations and all that. And I was reading Paulo Freire's work on pedagogy of the oppressed and what it means for someone who has been oppressed to kind of take control of their story. And he talks about the fact that the oppressor can never rehabilitate the ethical myth, that it has to come from that community. So here I was trying to write an essay on the ethics of the Jacob narrative, no longer with my group of 6 collaborators, all on my own. and working out in my head what is, and I read Frere and I went, oh, that's it. I'm doing it. I've fallen back into the trap of thinking now I can do. I can't. And that's about being kind of trapped in a world of understanding that I come from a particular space where I can never approach what it means for someone who is an involuntary migrant, who's had that experience of something like dealing with the Home Office, to think about telling a falsehood in that situation. I can't really work that out. Someone from that perspective needs to work that out. And what was driven home to me was that was a place where my responsibility, I think as a scholar, but all the more as a Christian scholar, was to raise my hand as I did in the essay and go, I can't do this. And actually, if you're reading this, you probably can't do it either, because you're probably highly educated, privileged, relatively wealthy, et cetera. Maybe a lot of us just need to put our hands up and say, we need to stop doing that.
Yeah.
Unless we're doing it alongside and in collaboration with people who can understand this more directly. And that's about, in one sense, I suppose, quite a lot of what all of this work has taught me from the very beginning through to that is to be very aware of our kind of hubris about what we're capable of, not to denigrate ourselves, not to think that we don't bring anything, but especially those that have been theologically trained to be wary of that we don't forget our kind of human finitude and our human limitations, and how much our experience both can help us in some cases, but can limit us in others, and to try and be really deeply aware of that. And especially if we know that there are aspects of our experience that are aspects of privilege, to try and heighten our awareness to where those might preclude us from doing things in the way that we want to, and open up the opportunity for us to invite people who wouldn't normally have that platform or that access into doing it with us.
Ironically, if people who are aware, and you talk very clearly about an awareness of your own positionality, if people that are aware of that shut up, it tends to be the people that are unaware that just fill those spaces. So how do we work this through? And I like the idea of, actually, this is not something that becomes an either or, it becomes a both and, that we do things with people in order to move things forward.
Yeah, so I'm just a huge believer in collaboration, just about anything. But I mean, you can explain that, you can think about that in all sorts of ways. Part of that, I guess maybe it's one way of handling the frequent experience that you have as an academic of running into people and you think, my God, they know so much more about that than I do. Why would I try and figure it out when they already know? Like, why don't I just work with, that sort of person? Theologically speaking, it's very robust. I mean, if you go and look at scripture and look at what the Apostle Paul says about, the we only function properly when we function together as a body because of the different giftings and limitations and that sort of stuff. So I mean, what I would underscore is what you say is that the danger is in just being silent, and that space being filled up by people who don't realize that perhaps they should have a bit more hesitation and humility. And so the goal is to vocally take the risk of identifying one's own limitations. I mean, I wrote my friend back when I said, look, I've come to the end of this essay, and part of what I've done is said that the Western ethical tradition should stop, which might not be terribly well received, and that I shouldn't have written this essay. I'm not sure how much the publisher's going to like that as a result. Are you okay with that? And we talked about it. She goes, no, I'm okay with that. It's, if you're willing to put that under your name, then I'm willing to have that in the book. So some of it is being vocal about our limitations, which is not being silent. It's trying to encourage other people to see them as well. And part of it is doing whatever we can to work in partnership with the voices that haven't typically been part of these conversations, to bring them in and to work together with them. Because it's not that, again, that I have nothing to bring. It's that what I can offer is limited in various ways, and that that actually me being at the table with others is a more well-rounded and robust thing than me being totally absent, unless we get into a conversation and those people go, actually, we need you to leave to have the conversation we need to have.
Yeah.
And there will be times when that's the case as well. But the work with, the work alongside as a model,
Yeah.
almost whatever the topic and whatever the situation, I think is, is the big lesson I've learned methodologically.
Yeah. And in some ways it's faithful to the actual text themselves as a text of community rather than a text of just an individual.
So you can go back to, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways you can go back and do this, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff that happens in Judaism that requires a quora of 10. It's men. It's always men because of the patriarchal nature of Judaism. But the point is, it requires a community. You have to have 10 people to do certain things, and one of them is certain sort of kind of forms of discussion and disputation about the text. Because these were never meant to be really studied in isolation the way we think of that. I mean, the idea that that's, what genius is the single person in a room alone holding all the knowledge in their head is a very sort of late 18th and 19th century European phenomena from Romanticism. That's not the way the world really were. That's not the way most scholars operated. That's certainly not the way most scholarly communities, right? Because why did you have monasteries? Because you had all these people together doing this study, together as a community, steeped in a rule of life and a spiritual set of disciplines, and engaging, intellectually as well. And we've fallen out of that in a lot of ways. And so, part of what I suppose I want to advocate for in some senses has a very, sort of pre-modern, element to the role of community.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm really interested in is, you're obviously a priest as well, and you've got a role with the bishop, in an advisory role. How do you see, these old ancient texts? How do you see them informing public life and public dialogue? Because, in some ways, it's one thing for a group of us to be thinking about Jacob and all that kind of stuff, but how do you see that speaking into some of the very real issues that Genevieve's written down the side, to actually create a change within society? What's the process that we need to, how do we handle those texts to be able to speak them?
Well, so it was interesting, and in the lead up to this, we talked a little bit about what have I been reading in response to this. And one of the things that I went back and the two primary things I went and grabbed them and put them on my desk here that I've been reading. One is selected writings of Martin Luther King Jr. And the other is I've gone back and reread William Temple's Christianity and Social Order. And the reason is because I'm not 100% sure how to answer that text, but there are a lot of people who, right, you don't have to go very far back in the Christian tradition, even in this country or in the United States, to find people who were doing that in a way that made substantial, identifiable, positive change. Right. If you want to talk about Temple's, influence on the Education Act and the NHS, King's obvious influence on civil rights in the United States and all that sort of stuff. So, part of it, I suppose, is a sort of kind of silly answer, Andrew, but you just have to, the first step is to take the first step, which is to believe, through a posture of faith, that these texts do have something to say, that they can influence that view. Now, like in this sense, I'm a very traditional Anglican. I believe in the way in which Scripture, tradition, reason and experience together inform our understanding of all things, right? So, insofar as I'm going to think about policy and and anything to do with the social order, society, community, whatever, that all four of those things, Scripture being one of them. And for me, coming from a very Reformed kind of Protestant tradition, being perhaps the most important, really is my starting point, but I'm also biased as a biblical scholar, right? You ask someone who's, a sociologist, they'll probably tell you they have a slightly different starting point. What I would say then is, especially when you look at the times in which Christians have have had the capacity to really make an impact on culture, it's when they have begun with an understanding of their text that is a text written by the marginalized to the marginalized. Now, there's a relative thing. Within their own societies, the people that wrote these texts were elite. They were very learned. They were very privileged. But when we look at them on the broader stage, the world stage, they were largely marginalized. They were colonized, not colonizing. They were economically, marginalized rather than the wealthiest in all the world. So you have to be a bit careful there. But it begins from recognizing these are texts written by marginalized people to other marginalized people about that experience of marginalization and the response to it. And when we use that as a way of looking around us and not saying, okay, well, that means that the church should think it has to be a marginal community, but that the church absolutely has, as is very clear in the New Testament, the call to be with, alongside, supporting, caring for, amplifying the voices of the marginalized. That's when our text speaks. That's when, that's why we often tie ourselves in knots. We make ourselves look like human pretzels trying to do ethics and political thought with this, because we're trying to think about how you do power with the Bible, but wrong, revise, resubmit. That question doesn't work here. It's not really native to the text and the experience. And that doesn't mean we don't grapple with those questions. But Scripture informs us in one way. Scripture, by and large, insofar as it speaks to society, speaks to us about reminding us that no matter how privileged we are, it is, to borrow the Catholic phrase, it's the preferential option for the poor. It's the seeing that is our primary calling, to seeing how we, Temple was one of the most educated, most privileged people in the world when he was Archbishop of York and Archbishop of Canterbury, and absolutely spent every bit of that privilege for what he saw as the good of the whole of society, but especially the least of British society. And in spending it for the least, he benefited everyone, right? No one would say that the NHS was not a benefit for everyone in some ways. No one would say that the Education Act was not a benefit from someone in some ways, but it was because he spent every bit of the social, political, and economic capital that he had towards that sort of stuff.
For anybody who's not read any Temple, the book that I think you're referring to is Church, Christianity and the Social Order, which in some ways becomes a real inspiration to Beveridge and the setting up of the welfare state back in their 40s. Another interesting book related, that kind of reflecting back on that, is Anglican Social Theology. It's a collection of essays written probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. The kind of and one of those essays charts the kind of Temple tradition throughout the last 50, 60 years. Just one last question before we break out into groups, Casey. From all of the stuff that you've looked at, and I'm really thinking around the migration thing again, what would be, in a couple of sentences, the kind of real take home, actually, if you've heard nothing about that subject, that this is the really important message?
As far as what's in the biblical text, or as far as what
However
relates?
you want to answer the question.
All right. Well, let me give you three statements or three sentences, right? Because when in doubt, be Trinitarian. So the first is that there's I think, very strong argument that one can describe the entire Bible as an anthology of texts written by involuntary migrants to other involuntary migrants about involuntary migration. So, which is to say, it's just all over the Bible. So if you don't care about it, then or you don't see that it's an issue that Christians should be worried about, people that care about the Bible should be worried about, I think you need to reread the text. The second that I would say, and I can point people towards places where I've said this in much more detail, is that the theological takeaway, constructive theological, what do we do, is that there are obligations on the way both migrants should respond to the cultures they migrate into, but also on the hosts in those cultures that are receiving them. And in particular, in Britain, where we are a host culture, that those responsibilities look like the self-sacrificial care for the other described in the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which the Samaritan not only cares for the foreigner, but puts themselves at risk of actual harm in order to care for the foreigner. So the idea that the migrant might be dangerous to us only puts us right into the space that the Bible describes we should already be in. The final point, and I would now articulate this in a way maybe that's very similar to what Temple did in some of his, is that all of that being said, there is still no simple step from biblical interpretation and theological reflection to the right policy. But absolutely, Christians should be engaged at a local level, at a national level, and at an international level in trying to shape the way that organizations that they have any influence on, whether that's as a voter, a member, a taxpayer, whatever it is, how they think about and respond to migration, which has been and will continue to be one of the most thorny and important social and political issues for us to deal with going forward.